Hello, my name is Matt Conweiser, and I'm going to talk a little bit about IBM's approach to building a risk-forward security posture. But in order to understand why we're doing this, the first thing that you have to understand is that threats are heavily industrialized. There are people that come to their office every morning at 8 or 8:30, just like we all do, sit down at a desk and try and break into systems. And they sit shoulder to shoulder with 10, 100,000 other people just like them whose jobs it is to break into other systems. When you contrast that to most enterprise security postures, they're still sitting there looking in the rearview mirror. There's a huge focus on capturing logs and doing analysis on things that already happened in the past. And the biggest challenge is that when you use a backward-looking approach to security against industrialized threats, you are absolutely going to miss something, and there is a very high probability that you will, in fact, be breached. And that's where the second piece of this comes in. Now, everybody's probably heard of governance, risk, and compliance as it relates to security and IT, and we're really not going to cover that. And there's a number of reasons why, but some of the most obvious are, number one, we're seeing industrialized threats happening very, very quickly, and the vectors are adapting and changing on a regular basis. And the governance, risk, and compliance rule sets and the audit rule sets aren't keeping up, nor can they, because the amount of time it takes for a government to change and then change its policies again and again are never going to keep up with the speed at which hackers can revolutionize how they hack. It's just not going to happen. The other major reason is that what we're seeing as it relates to GRC tactics is that there's a huge emphasis on running reports, and it is very past looking. We're trying to encourage our client base to be more forward looking in their security posture. And because of the nature of GRC itself, and because of the slowness in which the policies and regulations can actually be updated, we don't see it as valid as it used to be to define what a good security posture really is. What we're going to look at instead is the concept of three key variables. And the first one is threat. It is a constant. It is always going to be there. You cannot control it. You can't predict it. You can't tell how many there's going to be. The second is vulnerability. And vulnerabilities are not the number of machines that are scanned on a network. Vulnerabilities are the number of open doors you are allowing those threats to walk through. And ultimately, the impact here is to business risk, not technology and security risk as it's defined in the GRC construct, but actual business risk. What are the dollar values that are going to be walking out the door if one of these threats finds one of your vulnerabilities? And it becomes an equation. The lower your vulnerabilities are, the lower your risk will be. It's as simple as that. If you can ever get your vulnerabilities to zero, no matter how big your threats are, your risk will always be zero. And of course, we know that that's not attainable, but it can certainly be a vision. And it should be every security enterprise's vision to reach a vulnerability state of zero. So let's talk about things we can do to get there. The first thing you have to do is understand where your vulnerabilities are that are worth addressing based on the risk that they pose. So if you look at a simple graph of probability of impact versus cost of impact, you have outliers. For example, getting caught in the rain. Because if you get caught in the rain, it's probably going to happen a lot. You're going to get wet, but you dry off. So the actual cost of that is very minimal, which means that the probability, although it's very high, is not something you need to be terribly concerned about. But the opposite end of that spectrum is getting struck by lightning. The chances of it happening are very, very, very slim. But when it does, it is a significant financial, emotional impact to the people that get hit. But at the same time, as a business, it's also very difficult to put a ton of resources into dealing with that because it is such a rare occurrence. So what you're looking for is that sweet spot where the cost of impact is high enough and the probability of impact is high enough that it is really worth your and your team's time and attention to focus on. Things like access control issues, facilities and business continuity issues, and of course insider and privileged user issues. And there may be many more. We'd love to work with you to identify exactly what lives inside your sweet spot. But as we move forward here, The other key way to deal with this is to understand from a human impact and a storytelling perspective just what security can and cannot do for your environment. So as we take a look at this, there's 4 basic steps to any process for somebody that has information in their environment, which is every business in the world. You have people. These people interact with devices. These devices sit on networks, and the networks connect those devices and people to information. It is a, I would say, relatively inarguable procession of content. So let's look at one particular story, and this involves phishing because this is a major concern. So in a phishing attack, you've got an outside bad actor that goes directly towards an individual. And that individual uses their device to go back to a website that they believe to be legitimate, and they put in their credentials, at which point the bad actor not only has their credentials, but can potentially then inject malicious code onto the device that they access that website from. So at this point, you've got a bad actor that's got bad code on a device that they control and a set of credentials. And they can use either one or both of those to exploit, to get into the networks, to get information, and to steal that information. So that's a pretty common phishing model. Now, how might we deal with this? Well, the first thing you can do is you obviously have the ability to block the information from leaving your environment. And that would prevent the bad actor from getting it, but you've still let them get very far into your environment. So we would actually not only do that, but take it another step back and say, you know what, maybe we can do better things on the database. Maybe we can detect behavioral anomalies, anomalous logins by either user or time of day, or what they're trying to access, and shut them down. We may also be able to understand that certain users have been compromised or certain devices have been compromised, and at the database level, block those users and devices from even logging in the first place. But that still assumes that the bad actor has gotten pretty far into the environment. So we can actually look at the networks and determine whether the networks are passing traffic that they're supposed to be passing when it's supposed to be passed. And if it isn't, then we can block it there as well. But of course, the endpoint still has malicious code on it, and we can prevent that endpoint from even being able to install that malicious code. We can look at chained patterns of activity within the machine itself to say, you know what, this app is acting a bit rogue. We're going to shut it down. This Java needs to be locked down so it can't even run a rogue web app in the first place. Or other types of detection on the system that really relates to behavioral activity patterning. We also have the ability to shut things down at the credential level. So if a user tries to use their corporate credentials on a website, whether they think it belongs to the company or not, but it's off the network, we can actually block that. And if they try and log into a foreign site, they'll get a pop-up saying, you now have to change your corporate password. But of course, this all does also come back to the user themselves. And governance and training cannot be overlooked as part of a complete security posture. But most importantly, you need overall and end-to-end visibility. And the reason why you need this is because if you look at all of these different methods, the data leaving the environment, the database protection, the network protection, the endpoints, the credential monitoring, and the personnel and governance and training, all of those things individually could signal problems. And if you have to chase down every single event or alert that goes off for each one of these by themselves, your security team is going to spend a full-time job just chasing ghosts. By looking at all of this at once, it is possible to chain and pattern a set of behaviors from the user clicking on an email to that user's credentials being used and that user's workstation being used to log into a database that wants to send information out of the environment. And instead of chasing down 5 or 6 different things and relying on a human factor to try and correlate all of that together over a time frame, having an analytics system that can look at all of that at once without having to be told what to look for, and simply understanding that this is a pattern of suspicious behavior and all of it needs to be grouped together and reported, is absolutely invaluable from a phishing perspective. Because the bottom line is this: you just don't know how you can prioritize one element of security over another when you don't know where that next attack is coming from or what they're going after. So going back to the risk conversation, instead of trying to deploy every safeguard across your entire security environment generically, focus your efforts on safeguarding these types of patterns against the information and data that your organization holds most dear. If you can isolate that critical piece of information or pieces of information, and you can protect the 5 or 6 different areas of all the different people that can access just that critical information, you can create a very focused security project that will provide a maximum amount of protection with a minimum amount of investment and headache. So that's our first story. Now let's look at our second one. Many organizations have to deal with fraud of many different types, whether it's manipulating information or direct financial or insurance fraud. So let's look at that. So in a database, you see a whole series of transactions, and a fraud system might see one anomalous transaction and flag it immediately. At that point, the fraud department, which is typically not integrated with the security team, will then take their remediation steps. They'll send emails or text messages or phone calls. They'll try and verify whether this is accurate, and if it isn't, they'll flag it and potentially suspend the transaction. But what also needs to happen is there needs to be a connection back to the security team, because there's a whole set of information that leads up to that fraudulent transaction. And if the security platform is gathering all that data, then at the same time that that fraudulent transaction has been detected, the security platform can initiate an investigation of its own and potentially help to pinpoint exactly where that came from and when and how. And if you know when, how, and where, you can see if that bad actor did any other damage to your environment that may not be fraud related. But you're going to miss those types of things if the fraud and the security teams are not directly connected. So that's the second story. Now, the third one is the scariest, and it's all about insider. You have an individual that simply turns bad. Maybe they're upset at the company, maybe they disagree with a decision that the company has made, or maybe they've been externally influenced or coerced, and they simply go straight to the critical information and steal it. They're allowed to do it. They have permissions to access it because this is somebody that you trust. This is somebody that you've brought into your inner circle, you've credentialed, you've allowed them to have this information as part of their day job, and they've fundamentally betrayed you. So how can you effectively prevent this? Well, the answer is you can't. But there are things you can do to be more aware of what's happening. And one of those things is to use non-security information. So you can look at things like social media and global factors. You can look at things like which employees have access to which types of information that may be more relevant or sensitive based on global indicators. You can look at personnel profiles, and you can look at personnel activity. When do they normally log in and log out? What do they do when they're on the environment? You can take all of this information and feed it into a cognitive system that is linked back to the security system that allows us to put a magnifying glass on the right users at the right times only. And what will happen is when a user starts to turn bad, we can immediately alert the data systems so that when that user tries to access sensitive information, they're simply blocked. And if it's a mistake, they call IT, they get their credentials reinstated, and they have access. And if it isn't, then that employee, in the mere attempt of trying to steal information, will be made to understand very clearly that they've been caught and that they need to be very, very careful with their next steps. Now, there's a lot of sensitivity around this particular step, but the illustration here is to make the point that unless you're using cognitive security, unless you're using all of the means and all of the information that is public or that is available to you as a security team within your organization to detect your risk factors that can impact your business, you're not doing everything in your power to protect your critical assets. So, let's take a look at what's happening inside the machine. I've given you the 3 high-level stories to tell. Now let's look at what happens under the covers. So, we have our internet, we have our internal users and devices, and we have our privileged users. So the first thing we do to shield our internal users from the internet is to establish the basics: firewalls, anti-spam, antivirus, routing policies, and traffic monitoring. But every corporation, every enterprise has services that they offer, and they offer those through apps, through portals, and through websites. and there's public-facing content, and then there's internal servers and sensitive information. All of that needs to be protected. You need to do testing on your apps. You need to do testing on your web apps and your portals. You need to do testing on your servers. You need to implement intrusion prevention to make sure that as people log into the content, they can't get to servers in ways they're not supposed to be. You need to have database integrity and tampering monitoring, and on the endpoints, you really need to have advanced persistent threat monitoring. So some of the things that can happen is detection of people trying to run things they shouldn't and shutting them down. People reusing their credentials and shutting them down. And then I can't reinforce enough the importance of that overall analytical view. So each of these are different product sets or product families. And if we go back to our original 4 areas, people, devices, networks, and information, what we'll see is that for each area, there are specific products and services that can help to address the vulnerabilities in those areas that all contribute to business risk. Things like database masking, encryption, and anomaly detection, prevention of east-west anomalous traffic on the network and north-south through IDS and IPS, multiple different methods of protecting devices, whether they be mobile devices, phones, or laptops, through the use of exploit chain disruption, patch management, protection of and sandboxing of critical data, and isolation of information, as well as forcing those devices to use certain encrypted channels based on the type of data. And then finally, identity and access governance and management. And then over all of that is our broad-based analytics platforms. Now you look at this and you may think this is a complete security posture. But the reality of it is not. This is actually only one piece of a complete security posture. All of those things fall into the traditional security product construct. And what you need to build on that, first of all, is industry expertise. There are people out there that work with lots and lots of clients in similar businesses to yourself that we've worked with, and we can take to you the experience and the knowledge that we've gained from working with all those other clients and make recommendations on how to tune and hone your traditional security products to be better tailored to protect the critical information that is most relevant and contextual to you. But that's also not enough, because most people don't have enough of a security team to manage everything they'd like to manage. And so part of this also is separating the noise from the core meaningful content. And sometimes that noise has to be managed because it's critical to the audit and the governance processes of your organization and of a lot of federal regulatory bodies. So sometimes it's better to have a blended approach where some of it is outsourced and the most meaningful core content is managed directly by you. But on top of that, if you're not looking at other people's zero-day problems and other known signatures that big groups are finding and uploading to sites, then you're missing something. Because most likely, your zero-day is not somebody else's. There are other people that have experienced it beforehand. And if you can understand that and use that data and incorporated it into your security model, you will be better off, because you're going to start detecting knowns and filtering them out and allowing you to focus again back on protecting your core content more quickly. And like we talked about in the fraud story, you also cannot underestimate the power of general analytics and big data in the construct of security, because there will be things that the analytics teams will find that need to be relevant to your security stack, and there are things that you will find that need to be relevant to the analytics teams. And there has to be a tight coupling and sharing of information between those organizations. And then finally, cognitive. You have to be able to look at the systems and ingest tons of information, whether it's social media, public indicators, corporate indicators, government threat, political, everything. Ingest all of that and use that as a function of understanding your risk based on specific individuals, specific business units and product offerings, and even just the general climate of the industry. It is absolutely essential to build that into your process. Now, this is not something that can be implemented overnight, this stack. It's a very complex stack, but it is a very orderly process to implement it, and none of this is future. This is all in existence today, and it's stuff that we can work with you to get deployed. And that is exactly what we'd ask. Now, the devil is always in the details. This is just the first step. The next thing we need to do is understand everything we can about your specific business, your business challenges, the definitions that you have for your most sensitive data and why you believe it to be that, and how you're protecting it today. So this is just an introduction, but it's an important one because we've given you the simple stories you can tell your business leaders and your executives. We've given you the details and supporting information to let you know this is not dreamware, this is reality, and it's something we can talk about and start to design for you today. And we're asking you for a partnership moving forward to make all of that a reality. And ultimately, we're just here to help. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing back from you or having you contact your local IBM resource.